All right, everyone, welcome to the sanctuary of the African Meeting House. This is where the Baptist Church met and worshiped from 1806 until 1890 when they moved to a new building in another part of the city. But the reason that was called the African Baptist Church, but this is called the African Meeting House, has to do with what these church buildings meant in early New England. Because at the time, people would say that the church was the people, not the building, and wherever they happened to meet, that's where the church was. But they would use the buildings, which they called the meeting houses, not only for church meetings, but also for political meetings, for town government, and for any other kind of major meeting they needed to have. And so this building had that function for African Americans here in Boston. It was not only a church, but also the central social and political organizing space. And so a lot of the events that happened in this room where we're standing now had a lot of major political impact in Boston and beyond. For instance, people worked together to change things in the city and in the state to make life more equal and more just, not only trying to integrate the schools, but also trying to make it so that people could ride public transportation together regardless of race, so that they could marry people of other races, and other kinds of state laws that they managed to change. But they also talked about the issues facing African Americans throughout the United States. And in the 1800s, the biggest issue was the issue of slavery and the racial discrimination that people faced throughout the country. And so people came here to talk about these issues, and some of them were very early leaders in the abolitionist movement. How many of you know the word abolitionism from the video? Yes? Awesome. Huge number of people. Can I ask you to tell me what it means?
It basically means that people fight for their rights.
Yes, they fight for their rights, but one right in particular. Anybody know?
Civil.
Yes?
For the liberty of African Americans?
Yes, a civil right, but the right to not be enslaved, the right to be free in a general sense, to own yourself. And so that was something that people got involved in even in states where slavery was not legal, because they saw it as a problem facing everyone. And they also saw racism throughout the country as connected to slavery. They thought at the time that because people could be enslaved in some parts of the country, that meant they could never be equal in others, because people would always look at them as possibly a slave. And so these two fights for liberty and for civil rights were very much connected. So one of the people who spoke here early on was very groundbreaking, a woman named Mariah Stewart. And she was groundbreaking not only because of what she said, but of the fact that it was a woman standing up and speaking about politics at a time when women didn't speak to men, and African American women also didn't get large audiences for political speeches. And so she said some things that upset people, saying that people who were working just for racial equality or just for women's rights were not doing enough and they had to do both. But she's also the first person to say these things and to connect, in some ways, these issues of racism and slavery across the country. She had her speeches published in a newspaper called The Liberator, and this was Boston's anti-slavery abolitionist newspaper. It was started by a white abolitionist named William Lloyd Garrison, who tried very hard to ally and work with black abolitionists and also to respect women's rights. And so he published Mariah Stewart's speeches, and he also spoke here and got involved with many of the leading black abolitionists like William Cooper Nell, and then also like Frederick Douglass. And you heard about him in the video too. He is, I would say, our most famous abolitionist in American history. He was a man who was born in slavery himself and managed to escape and became the most prominent and famous speaker and writer against slavery in the country. And he spoke here, as well as many other places around Boston, about 80 times. People knew his face across the entire nation. And he said things like, at a time when people were trying politically to avoid the United States splitting into war over slavery, he said that maybe it was worth the bloodshed and worth the war because of the huge human cost and the bloodshed that slavery already was causing. These could be dangerous things to say, but he and many others said them publicly, and they also put actions behind their words. They didn't only speak in this building, but they came together to organize the Underground Railroad. How many of maybe you've heard of the Underground Railroad. Some? Yeah. Everybody? All right. So the Underground Railroad is a little bit of a strange name because it isn't underground or a railroad. However, when they say underground, they mean the secrecy required. And when they say railroad, they're talking about the long, long journeys that African Americans had to follow to get to free territories where they could not be enslaved and their rights would be respected. Now, up till 1850, the end of the Underground Railroad could be in Boston or many other northern states. People like Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery, going through whatever means of transportation they could, staying with people who wanted to help them, and eventually starting new lives over. However, after 1850, the U.S. passed a law saying that people living in free states could again be arrested and sent back into slavery throughout the North. And so at that point, people had to go all the way to Canada in order to be legally free. And so people in Boston at this point came into this room to organize their part of this network and try to figure out how they could help people making that journey north. And many, many of the houses right around this building and throughout this neighborhood were safe houses on the Underground Railroad, where people stayed on that journey north, and where many ordinary people sacrificed whatever they could in terms of their money, their time, transportation, in some cases even their food, their clothing, and their own safety when they're trying to help other people make this illegal journey to freedom. And so not only is this an important site of speeches, but also an incredibly important place where ordinary people came together and tried to seek justice even when the laws themselves were so unjust. Now, this eventually came to a head with our Civil War, when these tensions between the North and South over slavery were not things that we could overcome politically. And that Civil War lasted from 1861 until 1863. And many African Americans wanted to join, not only to end slavery nationally, but also to fight for their civil rights here in the North, the rights to run for political office, for instance. And so they fought to get into the Army, and it took 2 years before the President, Abraham Lincoln, allowed African Americans to join. Now, the first regiment, the first group of these men who were African American soldiers fighting for the North, actually came to this building to sign up. This was a recruitment center for that first regiment, the 54th Regiment in Massachusetts. Even 2 of Frederick Douglass's own sons went to fight in that regiment. And so they were the first of almost 200,000 black soldiers who helped to win the war. And the consequences of that war really changed the fabric of the United States forever. Not only did we outlaw slavery nationwide after the war, but we also established our first national definition of citizenship. Our Constitution never said what it meant to be a citizen until we passed an amendment after the war, saying that anyone who's born in the United States is an American citizen. That is still at the core of what it means to be an American, and that is because of the freedom that African Americans fought for, as well as the right for all citizens to vote. That was another consequence of that Civil War, even though making sure that people had that right in practice took another 100 years of the Civil Rights Movement. And so people in this building and in this neighborhood in Boston had a major national impact, not just for African Americans, but in terms of shaping the direction of American history. And so just to tell you what you're seeing today, this is what the building would have looked like in 1855, at the height of all these movements for equality. The architecture is a very traditional New England style. The lamps on the walls are replicas, but they're made from one that survived in pieces, and they reconstructed what they looked like. And then the pews you're sitting on are replicas as well, but the one in the back right is original. It is from the 1800s. And then finally,